Dear viewers, Time magazine had crossed out its December cover page with a red mark. And it's not the first time in a nearly 100-year history of the magazine that such a cover page with an X on it has been published. The magazine first crossed its cover page in 1945 to mark the death of Adolf Hitler. Later, a black X was placed over Japan's rising sun to mark the end of the World War II. Next time in 2003, when Saddam Hussein was killed, followed by the death of an Al-Qaeda leader, the founder of ISIS, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, in 2006. Most recently, this use of the red X came in 2011 after the killing of Osama bin Laden. However, along with the red mark, Time magazine has declared year 2020 as the worst year ever. In a featured year in review article, it has given account of some of the events that made 2020 a terrible year. A global pandemic, worldwide protests against racial injustice, economic loss, wildfires, hurricanes, and in the end, a contentious US presidential elections. This is the story of a year you will never want to revisit. There have been worse years in US history and certainly worse years in world history, but most of us alive today have seen nothing like this one. Fact is, we all hated 2020. In a world so divided, it's the one thing we all agree to, and there is absolutely no denying that 2020 was a terrible year. One tweet that went viral proclaimed 2020 as the Monday of years. And others say that 2020 is like looking both ways before crossing the road, then getting hit by a plane. The year started with Australia on fire. By March, around 46 million acres of land had burned. As a result, thousands of people were displaced, and according to worldwildlife.org, nearly 3 billion animals were harmed. Also, at the start of the 2020, we saw the United States and Iran nearly going to war after a US airstrike killed a top Iranian general on January 3rd. Iran retaliated by targeting American troops in Iraq on January 8. It was followed shortly by Iran unintentionally, as the letter said, shooting down the Ukrainian airliner, killing 176 people on board. Meanwhile, in May, worldwide protests against racial injustice erupted after George Floyd, an African American, was killed by a white police officer. Later in August, an explosion shattered Beirut. An estimated 157 people were killed and hundreds and thousands were displaced. Still, 2020 will be remembered as a year of a deadly virus, later declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization on March 11.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
Since then, the virus has so far killed more than 2 million people around the world. For those who didn't get sick, isolation was the hardest part. Depression followed, suicide rates increased, addiction problems all worsened in 2020. So yes, 2020 was a bad year. But was it really the worst year ever in world history? A self-therapy app, Bloom, recently asked 28 historians from major universities, including Cambridge, Oxford, Yale, and others, to choose the worst year in history, or as they said, the most stressful. Philip Parker, a British historian, led the effort. What he did, he compiled a list of the top most stressful years based on their global impact and asked these historians to choose, or simply to make their pick. The year that ranked as the world's worst was not 2020. It was 1348, the year of the deadliest pandemic ever recorded in human history, known as the Black Death. It killed an estimated 200 million people with 50% of mortality rate. The Holocaust in 1944, when nations were busy fighting the World War II, ranked second, followed by 1816 when a volcanic eruption in Indonesia blocked out the sun, starving millions. 2020 ranked sixth. Before this survey, in 2018, Michael McCormick, a historian and archaeologist who chairs the Harvard University Initiative for the Science of the Human Past, said that the beginning of the Dark Ages marked one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. Since then, the title of the worst year, also backed by the journal Science, is held by the year 536 AD. In fact, if you Google the worst year ever, most results will point to 536 AD. Why? Because that's the year when a volcano erupted in Iceland. What it did, it triggered a fog that plunged Europe, the Middle East, and most parts of Asia into darkness day and night for 18 months. As a result, temperatures dropped, crops failed, and people starved to death. This further led to an outbreak of a bubonic plague in 541 AD, causing the death of nearly 100 million people worldwide. Hence, bad as 2020 was, 536 was probably worse. Imagine being in darkness for 18 months. In 2020, the world at least had sunshine. Others point to year 1919 as the worst year ever. The year saw the end of the First World War, in which an estimated 40 million soldiers and civilians died. Meanwhile, the movement of armies and navies around the world in 1919 helped spread one of the deadliest flu viruses called the Spanish flu. It affected 500 million and killed an estimated 50 million people. There was no vaccine, and attempts to limit gatherings did not produce results. Hence, we see that when speaking of the worst year ever in human history, there are plenty of years to choose from. First of all, there have been plagues far worse than coronavirus. For example, after 1348, the Black Death killed nearly 200 million people worldwide. The Spanish flu in 1918 killed 50 million. The HIV/AIDS pandemic began in 1980s and has killed 32 million people so far. Moreover, COVID-19's timetable has been far, far better. Scientists have created vaccines in about a year for a virus not even identified when the year began. By comparison, it took around 1,000 years for smallpox to be completely eradicated in 1977. If you say that coronavirus has affected lives outside of the illness too, where most people have to spend their time in isolation, compare that to 536 AD, when most parts of the world population could not even look at the sky. Remember, there was no sunshine for 18 months. Isolation is hard, no doubt, but at least we have ways to stay in touch with each other that previous generations did not have. COVID-19 has shattered economies, but again, the situation has not yet reached the level of the 1929 to 33 economic crisis. Also, compare protests following the death of George Floyd to race riots in 1968 in the United States, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Months later, also in 1968, Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. And all this happening at a time when Vietnam War was taking place. So even when Time magazine declared 2020 as the worst year ever, it was not on account of its global impact. It says there have been worse years in world history. But when it says for most of us alive today have seen nothing like this one, it means for the present generation of people, for people who are alive today, for you and I, 2020 was the worst year ever.